go.
We can always like cut it and stuff.
Yeah, we can edit it. Post-production.
I will be careful with my answers.
Recording now?
Yeah.
So this is Professor John Lucer from the SC department,
Mhm.
and can you tell me how long have you been working on the software field for?
I hate to say 45 years.
45 years, that's a lot.
Veteran.
And was it all like in the same company or different companies?
Well, a brief history, and that'll, I think, tell you what you want. I started at Kodak as an industrial engineer, and I worked there for about 3 years, and that was in 1965. So from, from 1970 on, I got into their programming department. They call it MSD, Management Systems Development. And I mean, computers back then were big IBM mainframes. You know, they didn't have PCs at the time. They had DEC computers, which they call mini computers, which they used for controlling automation, because Kodak was they tried to automate everything. So, but I was mainly on the mainframes, programming in PL1, Fortran. I don't know if you've heard of some of those old languages, but all procedural. So I was there till I retired at 55 years of age, and then I went to work as a contractor to Xerox, because a lot of even though I started doing programming, eventually I ended up in management, being what they call a unit director, and then Kodak got into software engineering, CMM, capability maturity model. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah.
You've heard of it, okay. Carnegie Mellon, I think, did that, where they're trying to create a model for having the best environment to develop software. So Kodak went into CMM, and they trained everyone in CMM, and essentially the things we're learning in class. You know, you have requirements, you do a design, you write these things down, you review them. Everything we're doing in class is what they were teaching. So I went through that, and then eventually, when I got to be age of 55, that was after 31 years at Kodak, I said, well, I want to try something else. I don't want to be my whole career at Kodak. So I said, well, what can I do? So I looked outside, I looked at contracting jobs, and Xerox they were trying to do software engineering as well in a more formal way with CMM. They needed some help, and I had done CMM besides being unit director, actually helping the CMM process. So I went to work for Xerox in a group that developed process. They call it PMO group, Process Management Organization. It was the group that essentially each company may have a group, and at Xerox they call it PMO, where they make sure that all the different groups understand how software process is supposed to work, and then do audits of software, and that's part of the CMM also. So I did that for 7 years, and one of the things that Xerox and a lot of companies don't like you to be as a contractor for very long, because there's co-employment issues. So they said, John, you cannot work here anymore. So I left Xerox and then started working for Citibank, and that was as an employee, kind of as a project leader in management. And so I stayed there for 7 years, and then I retired at 69.
It's a lot of experience.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's when I say 45, and they've been 50 years, I don't know. So I've run the whole gamut of everything, from coding to testing to management to software process. And so then I came here, and they said, sure.
And when you work as a software engineer, what kind of roles did you have?
Well, I was a coder, I was a designer, I was SQA, software quality assurance. I was a tester. Actually, at Xerox, I did some testing. I mean, various roles. I was a manager, a project manager. Actually, I was project manager at for 7 years at, well, actually for about 10 years at Kodak, and then maybe 7 years at Citibank. I was project manager for actually student loan in Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
They have I don't know if you have student loans or anything like that, but they all are managed over there in Pittsburgh.
And would you say like each team member communicates differently depending on the role they have?
We all had project teams. When I was a project manager, we'd have to form teams. We'd have analysts, what they called analysts, people that analyze the requirements,
Mhm.
just like we're doing in class. And then we had designers and coders and testers, people that write test plans, like we're doing in class. And then I mentioned we had offshore testers in India. Actually, we had offshore coders in India. So your question about communications, and I'm relating more about the time at Citibank, because that's kind of what I remember the most lately. As far as they communicate, we'd have group meetings like
Mhm.
every week, and we'd get together and talk about the schedule and the plan, issues coming up. We'd have risks and action items and issues. Those would be things we would collect. And if we saw a big risk, say new technology or a new application or new environment, development environment, then we would identify those as risk and discuss those. But if you're just talking about the team interaction, other than having tasks that people would have to do, like go analyze these requirements or come up with these context diagrams, or sequence diagrams, or use case diagrams that we're doing now, people would just talk just like we're talking here.
Mhm.
So I don't think there were any big issues with the communications. Now, with the people in India, there would be, because we had coders, we had people that would do design documents, kind of like we do here, but then there were detailed design documents, which was almost pseudocode. So the pseudocode would be sent over to India, and then they would, because the analysts really like to code, or the designers really like to code, they don't like to design. So they would write pseudocode for the design, send it over to India, and then the Indians would just take it and copy paste and compile it and run their tests and do the unit tests. But for the testers, you would write test plans, and they would send the test plans over to India, and then they would write the test cases. And so because of the time difference, when it's day there, it's night here, because it's kind of almost opposite.
Yeah.
So you could finish your work here, send it to India. They would do their testing or coding. The results would come back during the day, and they would communicate, but mainly by email. Even though we did have phone conversations, we would do phone conversations at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning, because that would be the end of their day and the beginning of our day. So sometimes we had meetings, and we'd get everyone on the phone, on the call-in phone, and we'd do things like that.
So would you say you spend more time communicating rather than coding?
No, communicating, obviously email, it happens whenever it happens, but sometimes we'd have project meetings, I'm trying to think, once a week or twice a week, and that's when we'd all communicate together, other than via email. But no, we didn't spend overly amount of time communicating, because a lot of it was, the documentation was written. So essentially you'd write a design document or a test case document, and you would send that over to India or to your peers, and they would review it just like we did in the reviews just today, right?
Yeah.
So they would review it, and then you might get together in a review and say, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? So hopefully that you just wouldn't communicate. All communications was generally planned, but of course people could call on the phone or send emails, and they'd get to know it that way.
And do they use comments on code as a way of communicating?
You're saying, do they put comments in the
Yeah.
code? Well, that would be one of the standards. In fact, one of my things, I used to pay people for putting in comments. I'd give them candy or something. Okay, comments. because I agree with you, having comments in the code is essential. And we would look for that when we do a code review, did you comment things? So, yes, comments would be part of the communications, especially during the code reviews.
And would you say like it's relevant to communicate effectively with customers as well as with other members of the team?
That would happen beginning and late, because in the beginning you do the requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And in student loan, or even at Kodak or Xerox, well, Kodak and Xerox, we all had internal customers. Student loan, we had external customers like students, right, applying to get a loan.
Mm-hmm.
The teams, the development teams, did not talk to students. Okay, they had what they called I can't remember what they called them. I mean, there were analysts on the development side, but there were also business analysts. There were business analysts whose job it was to essentially be the interface between the end customer, and again, this was student loan, between the end customer and the development team. So the business analysts would write the requirements. They would figure out from maybe the marketing people. In fact, a lot of times the marketing people would be the ones that might talk to students or schools, because in student loan we had two customers. One was the student, the other was the school who was doing the loans. So a lot of the marketing people would go to the school and say, okay, you know, we want you to use our loans. How can we put it together, package it, or do whatever to make it so students would buy our loans? So they'd have that discussion, and then the marketing people would talk to the business people, or the business people might talk to the schools, and then they would write the requirements. And then our systems analysts would look at the requirements and change it into, a use case diagrams, the sort of things that we're doing here. So that's how that would work.
And is communication different, like whole process, if you're doing like different kinds of development models, like for say, if you were doing waterfall model
Mm-hmm.
versus incremental model?
Certainly some of the models are more formal, like the waterfall would be more formal. The more iterative ones would, because we've seen that in, when we've talked about different models, that they just go in circles, right? They just go over and over and over again. So maybe you're developing a prototype, and then you show it to the customer, and the customer gets your feedback, and then you go and you change it, and then you change it until you get it kind of right. Versus when you're doing the waterfall, the customer would give you requirements, the systems analyst may mock up some screens and say, this is what we want. The analyst would talk to the customer, is this the screen you want? Even though they can't see it work, but they can see kind of what it looks like. And they'd say yes, and then we'd forget about the customer, and then the analysts or the designers, developers, coders, and testers would code, and then when it was all done, towards the end, then we'd have the user acceptance test. Okay, so we go through integration test, system test, and then the business analyst would do the user acceptance test, at least in the waterfall, and hopefully it would be what the end user wanted. If it wasn't, then we'd be in trouble. But that's the advantage of the iterative cycles, that you get a lot of feedback from the customer, the end customer.
All right. And for say, would you say like there's a difference in the way you communicate with a project leader versus a regular team member?
Well, I don't see that much of a difference. The project leader should really understand kind of all the aspects of issues that are going on in the project.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he or she may not know how to code or how to test necessarily, but they should know kind of what a class is and what the issues are with getting these things to work. Probably couldn't code themselves, but I don't frankly see. I don't know exactly what you're trying to get at, because a lot of times the project managers may speak to upper management as well, whereas maybe the coder wouldn't. So the project manager has to have be diplomatic and not offend management and understand what management's doing, and then translate that to come to down to the team members. But so in that sense, the project manager, if that's what you're getting at, has to be able to communicate very well to all levels in the company, whereas the coder maybe just has to, talk code talk, if you will,
Yeah.
and not do return on investment or how pretty this is or something else that others might have to worry about. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Did I? Okay.
And for say nonverbal communication,
Mhm.
how would you consider that important in the software engineering field?
That's a tough one. I mean, nonverbal communication is important in life. I mean, you're crossing your arms like that right now, which is telling me you're bored a little bit. I'm just kidding. But that's
cold.
or it could be your cold too. But those are the nonverbal cues that people try to get. I was just making a point. A lot of times crossed arms means, I'm concerned or something. I didn't imply that you were that way, but it's a cue that everyone gets, even in this environment. And frankly, I don't see any difference in the nonverbal communication between people on a project team versus people out in society. Now, there's one obvious issue with that, is that usually people that are computer related are usually more introverted and maybe not as social conscious. I'm making a generalization because they like to get in there and code. They don't like to talk
It's kind of like a
fancy.
stereotype.
Yeah, it's a stereotype. And generally, people that get into the computer world are more introverted than extroverted, and so you may have some different communications there, but that's not true of everybody, certainly. But if I had to pick a generalization, that would be it. And I don't know if that helps you either, but
Definitely. So we noticed that the IEE, the Institution of Electrical Engineers,
okay.
they said that their employers are dissatisfied with the way their graduates communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that? Or would you say, would you know why that is
Well, it may be getting back to the point I was making before,
for the introverts?
that they're more introverted and just want to code. Obviously, that's a generalization too, and don't want to do small talk or don't want to learn the real problem, which is the danger for those people that are introverted and just want to say code. And not that everyone's that way, but if you don't understand really what's the problem that's trying to be solved, when you get into doing the coding, you may be given a choice: do I do this or that? Whereas if you knew really why you're doing this, you might choose that decision. So if they don't communicate and understand that, then they may not become as effective and useful as someone who has more of a general training. But for example, the argument has been used about liberal arts colleges. What's the value of a liberal arts college? You get a broad education in many areas versus someone who graduates from RIT and computer science. They don't have that broad. I mean, I know you probably have electives and things, but you may not get into philosophy and appreciation and music and that kind of thing. So you can't converse at a cocktail party, with upper management, and then they think these guys are, socially introverted and they don't want to speak at things. So I think you get what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
right? So the point is, you could make the argument that people should have more social aware courses or more liberal arts courses than technical courses. So
Mhm.
then you would, so there's a balance.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that was pretty good. That was the points we wanted to hit.
Oh, was it? That was it. Okay, good.